is to be deposed. His reasoning and argument is that those who rule as a king should be, which is a geographical position of power and strength for the papacy as it begins to expand its influence in the West. Charles Martel himself had a son, Pepin III, who would later be known as Pepin the Short. And because of the good relationships between this family and the papacy,
768.
Eventually the papacy sides against
My
the
apologies,
Merovingian
it's
kings
dark.
in favor of the new dynasty that is being formed around Pepin and Charles.
Pope
In
Zacharias.
751, Pope Zacharias actually decrees that the last Merovingian ruler, Childeric III, is to be deposed. His reasoning and argument is that those who rule as a king should be the de facto king. And so even though the fact that the Merovingians are king in name, it is the mayors of the palace, Pepin and Charles Martel and others, who are the actual rulers. And Childeric III has his hair cut off and he is banished and exiled to a monastery. And so as a result, the Merovingian Empire is swept away, at least in name, and into the place of power comes Pepin and Charles Martel and their dynasty. And one of the most important events of the time of Charles Martel and Pepin is the Battle of Tours.
The Battle of
Now, in a
Tours.
later lecture, we're going to look at the importance of the Muslim conquest of Spain, which gave rise to the kingdom of Al-Andalus. But one of the things we have to note is the extent to which the Muslim rulers of Spain attempted, to whatever extent they could, to take over Europe. Now, the armies that were taking over Spain at this time were the Umayyad dynasty, sometimes called the Saracens. And for 21 years, they had conquered Spain from Gibraltar all the way up to the very northern part of Spain. And in the 720s, this army crossed over the mountains into Aquitaine, which is modern-day France. Now, Aquitaine is not part of the Merovingian dynasty. Aquitaine is its own independent state. And at this time, Aquitaine is ruled by Otto. And Otto was actually an enemy of the Franks. Charles, in particular, had frequently skirmished with Otto in the Aquitaine regions. Charles, it seemed, wanted to take over these regions for himself to make them part of the Frankish Empire. And Otto, therefore, was an enemy to Charles. However, Otto had an even greater concern when the Saracen, or the Umayyad dynasty, crossed over the mountains into the region of Aquitaine. Otto did his best to repel the force. At one point, he manages to have a victory against the Umayyad armies. But before long, he is outnumbered and outmatched, and he is on the run. And of all the people that Otto has to appeal to for help, Otto reaches out to Charles. And Charles, of course, knows that an enemy is one thing, but to have a Muslim army advancing up into Europe creates a greater crisis. And therefore, he and Otto made a decision. Aquitaine, it was decided, would become part of the Frankish Empire. Otto would therefore join forces with Charles, and this joint army would
this is
fight
France.
back the Umayyad dynasty. And so in 732, we have the Battle of Tours. And to give comment about this battle, we have to know a little bit about warfare in the Middle Ages. Often in this time, you had more skirmishes than you had outright battles. Hollywood has often given us a picture of medieval battles or battles from any time before modern mechanized warfare. And usually what we see depicted on screen is something to the effect of all the armies rushing towards each other and engaging in sort of a mass hand-to-hand combat, and only the best will survive. Unfortunately, people back then knew that that just meant a lot of death and destruction, and your goal as a leader of an army was generally not to get your people killed as fast as possible, and running them indiscriminately towards the enemy usually would do that. Often what would happen in medieval warfare is you would have skirmishes, you would have advances and retreats, you would do everything you could to take out the supply lines for your enemy, you would try to scare them. Very often you had situations where armies would attempt to break up the discipline of the opposing army to get them to run indiscriminately in defeat. And if you managed to do that, you could of course kill people as they retreated from you, but often it meant that you won the battle, usually without losing significant numbers of your forces. The other factor of medieval warfare is that armies were rarely trained very well at all. Usually battles happened during certain seasons. You wouldn't go out, for example, during the dead of winter and try to engage in a battle. Also, if you took your forces from the fields, from your regions, from your lands, you would often need to send them back at some point, or else the harvest, the food you needed as a nation, would not be cultivated or would not be harvested. Now, when we look at Charles' army, we see something different. Charles is actually a very serious warrior. He knows how to fight. And one of the things he decides is through church funds, through money given to him by the papacy, again,
through tithes and offerings,
Charles
through the
is
church,
able to train his troops around the clock, year-round. Also, Charles knows tactics. He knows that the Umayyad dynasty that is coming up into France has cavalry, and that this cavalry is fast, it's quick, and it likes to charge at lines of foot soldiers, break them up, and quickly defeat its enemies and get them running. And so Charles decides that he's going to take a different tactic. He trains his armies very well. The core of it, he decides, is going to become a phalanx. Now, not the triangle-shaped phalanx we sometimes see in Greek history. Rather, he's going to form a bit of a square or a rectangle shape that is going to be an immovable phalanx.
Where they get that from?
The formation is meant to withstand a charge of cavalry and then kill the cavalrymen as they come into your ranks.
Where they get that from?
Charles also applies the element of surprise. He scopes out a piece of land in which there's a great number of trees and forests, and he takes the high land.
Sounds like guerrilla warfare.
Despite all of these advantages, that Charles knows his enemy, that he knows how to fight them, and that he has superior tactics and planning, does not belie the fact that Charles simply was outnumbered. Now, the numbers on both sides of the chronicles, whether we look at the Muslim chronicles or whether we look at Christian chronicles, are divergent on this. The Muslims like to believe that Charles Martel had something like 400,000 soldiers, which is significantly off the mark. And Charles Martel's chroniclers like to say that the Umayyad dynasty had innumerable forces that had crossed over into France. Modern estimations differ, but we do know that the Muslim army far outnumbered Charles Martel and his army. Probably the best estimates are that the Muslim army had somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers, a vast number of which, of course, would be cavalry. The best estimates of Charles' army is that they are somewhere in the range of 30,000. Now, as the Umayyad armies have advanced into France, one of the weaknesses that they self-impose, that they self-inflict, is that they have extended beyond their supply lines. They also were not prepared for the cold of the north of Europe. And so the larger numbers was somewhat at a disadvantage because the soldiers were not prepared for the weather and they had fewer supplies to work with. Just before the battle, Charles takes the high ground just outside of the city of Tours. He finds a high ridge with significant numbers of trees. He hides the majority of his armies within these trees, making sure that the Muslim armies believe that they have the advantage even more so than they already did. Out in front, there's a phalanx. And Charles had drilled them not to run, not to break, and to always hold the high ground. And for a period of time, it was a bit of Red Rover between these two armies. The Muslims, of course, knew that the high ground was not the place to go, even if you have superior cavalry one another, particularly in the Middle Ages. This is seen as one of the first major decisive battles between the two sides. Notice, by the way, that this is several hundred years before the Crusades. People often mistakenly believe that the Crusades were the first time that Muslims and Christians decided to take on political armies and start fighting. Actually, it happened from essentially the very beginning. The Umayyad dynasty had conquered certain parts of Spain, and they had encroached up into Europe, and as a result, the Christian armies led by Charles Martel repelled them. However, putting aside what this means for Christian and Muslim relations throughout the Middle Ages, this battle was hailed by all of Europe as an example of the Frankish power. That Charles Martel had not only displayed prowess in battle against other Europeans and other tribes, but now he had stood up for the faith, and he had repelled the Muslim armies that were coming to conquer and to ravage the church in Europe.
The Christian army.
The rise of the Frankish or the Carolingian Empire out of the Merovingians sets the stage for one of the greatest rulers to ever come on the scene in Europe.
Who
Charles
is that?
Martel's grandson was named Charles. And Charles would take the reign in the vision that Charles Martel and Pepin the Short set out for the Frankish dynasty. And he would achieve all of the vision that they had and more. And
What's
for
his
that,
name?
he would
What's
be
his
called
name?
Charles the Great, or as he is known to us, Charlemagne.
Charlemagne.
And so in the next lecture, we're going to pick up and continue the story of the Frankish dynasty